In 1399, Henry Bolingbroke was exiled here in Paris. Within the year, he received a double blow. His father, the Duke of Lancaster, died, and Richard seized all of Henry's vast inheritance for himself. Henry was left with nothing. But Richard had overreached himself. All landowners in England now had cause to fear for their own property. 22 years had passed since Henry had been made a Knight of the Garter with Richard, but now any vestige of cousinly feeling had gone, and Henry determined to reclaim what was rightfully his by force. En route, on this make-or-break journey back to England, Henry paused here at the great royal abbey of Saint-Denis. Saint-Denis was where the kings of France were buried. It was also where they came to receive the sacred banner of the Oriflamme, the standard of St. Louis, on their way to battle. Henry was on the way to his battle, and he needed all the help, human and divine, that he could get. But he made sure that God at least was on his side by a single revealing gesture. Before he left the abbey, he promised the abbot that he would restore to Saint-Denis the revenues of the little priory of Deerhurst in Gloucestershire, given to the abbey long, long ago by Edward the Confessor and purloined, like so much else, by Richard. Already, therefore, before he even left France, Henry saw himself as true King of England, fully able to redress Richard's wrongs. With a fleet of only 10 ships, Henry sailed round England to the Yorkshire coast. Luck was on his side, as Richard was away in Ireland. Yorkshire was the heartland of his confiscated estate. As Henry moved from castle to castle, they surrendered easily to their rightful master. As Henry marched south, his army swelled, reinforced by the great northern earls. Richard, back home, now sought safety in Edward I's great Welsh castles. But Henry lured him out with the promise that he came only to claim his inheritance of Lancaster and had no intention of threatening the crown itself. It was a lie, but it was a successful one. As Richard emerged, an ambush of Henry's men lay in waiting. The King of England was Henry Bolingbroke's prisoner. For it was clear that Henry wanted far more than just the Duchy of Lancaster. He would settle for nothing less than the crown of England itself. But how to justify dethroning Richard and replacing him with Henry? The neatest solution would be to show that Richard had never been true king by hereditary right anyway, but that Henry was. Conveniently, a story to this effect was an article of faith in the House of Lancaster. Henry and Richard were both descended from King Henry III. Richard from the eldest son, Edward, who'd succeeded as King Edward I, and Henry from the second son, Edmund, Earl of Lancaster, surnamed Crouchback. According to the story, however, Crouchback was really the eldest son, but he'd been shunted aside in favour of Edward on account of his supposed deformity. If this story were true, it was the perfect solution for Henry. So Henry referred the story to a specially convened panel of historians and constitutional experts. The panel was supposed to meet in secret, but then as now, constitutional experts are a garrulous lot, and one of the panel, Adam of Usk, recorded their deliberations in his chronicle here. Like all good historians, the panel went back to the sources, as Adam reports. Unfortunately for Henry, these unanimously confirmed that Edward was indeed the eldest son. Eduardus primogenitus regis Henrici. The Crouchback story was indeed too good to be true. Henry would have to think again. Richard, for his part, put up a brief struggle, but faced with the threat of force, he abdicated his throne to God. For the first time since the conquest, the continuity of the legitimate succession had to be deliberately broken. Only one body could do that: Parliament. Henry moved quickly, and a Parliament was summoned to meet here in Westminster Hall. The hall had been splendidly rebuilt by Richard as a monument to his own glory, but now it was to witness his final humiliation. First, the terms of the king's abdication were read out. Then followed a long list of the charges against him. Finally, he was declared dethroned and deposed, and his subjects renounced their allegiance. All this had taken place in Richard's absence, and the royal throne, under its great canopy of cloth of gold, had remained empty. But now Henry, in a theatrical gesture worthy of Richard himself, moved to lay claim to that vacant throne. He descended, he said, of the true royal blood of good King Henry III. Thanks to the help of God and his friends, he'd been able to reclaim that right, and in so doing, he'd saved the realm from ruin by the bad government of his predecessor, Richard. Put like that, Henry's claim sounds logical and convincing. In fact, it was a mere ragbag, for, in reality, he'd only a single compelling claim. He was the man of the hour. In 12 weeks, Henry Bolingbroke had transformed himself from a landless exile to Henry IV, King of England. But to prove that he was more than a usurper, he needed God's blessing as well as Parliament's. So, at his coronation, Henry was anointed with an opportunely rediscovered vial of holy oil reputedly given to Thomas Becket by the Virgin Mary. Divine oil would surely wash away the sins of his past. But Henry was about to commit the greatest sin of all. Richard may have been deposed by law before Parliament, but he was still an anointed monarch. However, Henry would have no security so long as Richard lived, so Henry decided to kill the former king. But secretly, and without leaving marks on the body. Richard was left slowly to starve to death in Pontefract Castle. Edward II, of course, had been murdered even more nastily, but none of the blame attached to his successor, Edward III. In 1399, however, the king had indeed murdered his predecessor king. The taboo was broken. What was there to stop others doing the same to Henry or his descendants? Only a year after Henry's coronation, in 1400, the Welsh rose up against English rule. But the greatest threat to Henry came from within England and from the family which had been his own strongest supporters. The Percys, whose head was the Earl of Northumberland, were the most powerful family in the north of England, with vast estates, strong castles, and a multitude of armed followers. They had been the first to back Henry in 1399, and it was their support which had carried him to victory. But having made Henry king, why should the Percys stop there, especially as Henry refused to behave as an obedient puppet? Perhaps they could do even better by backing another claimant. Perhaps a Percy could become king himself. Henry recognised the threat and did his best to conciliate them. But in 1403, he learned that Hotspur, the son and heir of the Earl of Northumberland, had joined the Welsh rebels and was invading England. Hotspur rode south to join up with the Welsh. On the 21st of July, 1403, the joint army arrived just outside Shrewsbury. From here, Hotspur sent a defiant message to Henry, challenging his right to the throne. Henry too was eager for a fight to the finish. The sides were evenly matched, and the battle raged from midday to nightfall. The hardest fighting was around the king and Hotspur. In the end, it was a personal battle between the two men. Henry was victorious. About 1,600 men were killed in the battle. Hotspur's own body was taken to Shrewsbury, where, as the corpse of a traitor, it was quartered. But the low-ranking slain of both sides were buried on the spot in a mass grave. In commemoration, the site was renamed Battlefield, and this church, complete with an armed statue of Henry IV, was built as a monument to his victory. But Henry's victory brought him no security, for no sooner had he cut down one enemy than another arose. Moreover, the king himself, doggedly though he fought, harboured private doubts. And if Henry doubted, why should anybody else believe the Lancastrian title? Henry IV's last years were a sad contrast to the promise of 1399. Gone was the vigorous crusading youth who'd won a country to his cause. Now he developed a disfiguring skin disease, perhaps leprosy, perhaps a psychosomatic acute dermatitis. Whatever the diagnosis, to many contemporaries, the disease seemed proof of God's displeasure at the usurper king. In March 1413, Henry came to Westminster with the hand of death already on him. On the 20th, whilst praying at the confessor's tomb, he had a seizure, and he was brought to this chamber here in the abbot's lodging. The crown was placed beside his pillow. He seemed to cease breathing, and his face was covered. Thinking, like everybody else, that his father was already dead, his son and heir, Prince Henry, took the crown. Suddenly, the old king roused himself and demanded of Henry by what right he took the crown, since he himself had none to it. Coolly, Henry replied, "As you have kept it by the sword, so will I keep it whilst I have life." It's a good story, and as an insight into the prince's character, it's shrewd. For whatever doubts Henry IV might have harboured about his right to the throne, Henry V had none at all. Prince Henry might not have been born to be king, but no heir to the throne has served a more distinguished apprenticeship. He was created Prince of Wales immediately after his father's accession, and, though he was only in his early teens, he quickly became his right-hand man. He fought bravely against Hotspur at the Battle of Shrewsbury, and he led the English to victory in the hard-fought campaign against the Welsh. But mere military glory wasn't enough for Prince Henry. He wanted the reality of power as well. His father was disfigured, diseased, and hopelessly tainted by the usurpation. Henry, in contrast, was the great white hope for his father's enemies as well as for his friends. Henry V's first task was to unite the fractured realm that his father had bequeathed to him. As the son of a usurper, Henry knew from personal experience the importance of letting bygones be bygones. So Henry pardoned his father's enemies and Richard's supporters. He even restored the purses.